Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a name that, well, it carries a lot of weight and two very different stories. Georgia.
That's right. You could be talking about the U.S. state or the country, right there at the crossroads of Europe and Asia.
And we've got a solid stack of your sources here. Articles, detailed research like a brief history of Georgia.pdf, and specific reports on things like the Civil War and economic impacts.
And our goal really is to unpack all of this, get a clear picture of the key moments, the events, the people who shaped both of these Georgias. We want to pull out the most important bits of knowledge for you.
It's quite a journey, really. Ancient cultures, colonial ambitions.
Revolution, conflict, huge transformations, and actually surprising diversity in both cases.
Yeah, two landscapes, fundamentally different, but sharing this one name. Okay, let's get into it. Starting with the U.S. state of Georgia.
Right. Geographically, think southeastern U.S. You've got Tennessee and South Carolina up north.
Atlantic Ocean to the east, Florida south, Alabama west.
A really strategic position, even from the beginning. And the sources tell us this land was home to native peoples, direct ancestors of the Creek Indians.
We see Europeans making contact pretty early, around 1540. That was the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto marching an army through.
Yeah, and the sources mention specific tribes, like the Yamacraws down by the coast, the Shawnees, known as warriors, up in the northern mountains.
And there were quite frequent skirmishes with the Creeks in the 1700s. One phrase from the sources really jumped out.
Which one?
It mentioned many slaves being captured by these Incas of Georgia.
Wow, Incas of Georgia. That's striking phrasing, isn't it? Connecting them to this powerful, sort of distant empire in that context of conflict.
It really is. And it underscores the intense pressure they were under. Around 1740, the sources say, leaders of the lower creeks actually settled and built a mound near the Little Whoopie River specifically to get away from all the constant warfare.
That detail really paints a picture, which leads us right into the colonial ambition behind the state's founding. Georgia gets its charter in 1732 from King George II.
Granted to a group headed by General James Edward Oglethorpe.
And Oglethorpe, he wasn't just a military guy. He was a social reformer, member of parliament.
And the sources mention something quite personal. He apparently lost a family member in a debtor's prison. That seems to have really shaped his vision.
Absolutely. His motivation was, well, layered. On one hand, yes, a defensive buffer, protect the Carolinas from the Spanish down in Florida.
Crucial strategic goal.
But also this philanthropic vision, a refuge for debtors, the honest poor, a way to tackle Britain's social issues, the debt, the overcrowded prisons.
So he and his friends formed the trustees for establishing the colony of Georgia in 1730.
And the first settlers arrive, about 135 of them under Oglethorpe, February 1733. Right at the mouth of the Savannah River.
Establishing the city of Savannah that same year. Good spot, near a bluff. And it grew fast, 800 people within 7 years.
And it wasn't just English settlers. The sources make a point of mentioning early diversity. Salzburgers from Austria arrives in 1734, built Ebenezer.
Moravians, Highland Scots too.
Right. But for those first 20 years, it was governed from London by the trustees. Kind of a child colony, the sources say.
Yeah, and they struggled, didn't they? Trying to enforce their rules against rum, against slavery, dealing with what they called an avaricious and reckless community.
Their whole idea of free-handed benevolence, it just clashed with reality. They had these strict rules. No slaves, no rum, and initially land holdings capped at 50 acres.
Which was way less than the 500 acres you could get if you paid your own passage.
Exactly. And that initial, almost utopian vision, it just ran headlong into the settlers' ambitions, especially when they looked next door at South Carolina booming.
So the argument started. Georgia's too small, too poor. Why these land limits? Why no slavery?
Especially from some of the emerging elites. They wanted big plantations, needing, they claimed, over 100 slaves. That fundamental conflict, the trustees' social experiment versus settler economics, was huge early on.
There's another figure mentioned, Mary Musgrove.
Ah, yes. Wealthy mixed-blood Creole. Owned an inn, a tavern.
And she negotiated between the Creeks and the British for 9 years. A really influential position.
But resented for it, the sources note. For her power, her wealth, even her role in procuring slaves. It shows just how complex that early society was. Race, power, the emerging slave economy, all tangled up.
Interestingly, those early relations with Native Americans, they started relatively well, friendlier than other colonies, apparently.
Oglethorpe treated leaders like Tomochichi, the Yamaqua chief,
Okay.
respectfully. There were even symbolic events like sending a Lower Creek delegation to England in 1736.
Which apparently yielded impressive results.
But it didn't last. As colonists pushed inland, disputes over land flared up. Conflict with settlers from South Carolina led to violence from Upper Creek towns. Figures like George Whitefield are even mentioned as stirring up distrust.
Plus French alliances adding to the anxieties.
Right, so that initial goodwill just eroded. And Oglethorpe's successor, Governor Henry Ellis, shifted strategy, more towards what the sources call a policy of diplomatic encroachment, basically asserting more control.
Okay, moving forward. The years before the Revolutionary War sound like a time of, well, turmoil and uncertainty.
Very much so. And it's amazing to think, in 1775, Georgia was the only colony still fully under British control.
They were hesitant, weren't they? The sources say sparse white population, smaller landholdings generally. People favored milder reform, not outright rebellion.
So it pushed them. Events like the closing of the port of Boston and, interestingly, the encouragement of a colonial post office.
Little things adding up, and key figures emerge. Lachlan McIntosh, Button Gwinnett, George Walton. They become the moving spirits.
There was unhappiness with the royal governor, James Wright, and his assembly. Apparently, they were busy with corrupt land deals. But resistance was pretty sporadic at first.
The Assembly even refused, initially, to send delegates to the Second Continental Congress.
But the pressure from radicals grew. Governor Wright eventually had to flee in early 1776, taking loyalists with him.
And the rebels moved fast. Set up an informal Congress, a Council of Safety.
But it wasn't unified. The sources mention a lot of fear and distrust. People questioning the rebels' authority, worried about the fanaticism. Some even petitioned to stay neutral.
And the land issue here, different from, say, New England, was a big factor. It stirred deep feelings, helped shift power away from the established planters.
Yet, despite all that division, Georgia did declare independence on July 4th, 1776. The war, though, was brutal for the state, especially early on.
Yeah, the British scored major victories. Savannah fell in December 1778, big fleet, lots of troops.
General Howe's rebel army, they were forced out by artillery, retreated in confusion to Augusta.
Which then fell too. Fultz abandoned. Georgia was, as the sources say, at the mercy of the invader.
A really grim period followed. British and Tories waging what's described as a war of extermination against personal enemies, burning plantations, stealing property, driving off slaves, even murders.
But that brutality backfired, didn't it?
It seems so. The sources say that mechanism of retribution wreaked itself upon the betrayers, because the vast majority of people actually supported the rebel cause.
So the British commanders, Campbell and Wright, they eventually had to ease up a bit.
Right. And after 1780, the fight continued mostly through guerrilla warfare. The state government was basically broke, couldn't collect taxes, couldn't really function.
But the war itself cemented that desire for independence. American supporters eventually took Augusta back from the British.
The royal governor had fled. The rebel Congress met in Augusta, declared the colony free, created the state of Georgia.
And they drafted an ordinance for Governor Council Assembly. Importantly, they ditched the old Commons property system.
Leading to the first state constitution, adopted February 13, 1777 in Savannah. That's the date the sources flag as the state's birthday.
And that constitution, it was quite something. The people were the source of all power. A really strong single legislature, the Assembly.
And a deliberately weak governor. Even judges weren't independent of the Assembly.
This created a climate of democratic fervor, but also led conservatives to want to roll things back towards the pre-war setup.
And the post-war challenges were huge. More territory from the Treaty of Paris, sure, but also counterfeit money, dodgy banks, massive land speculation. Towns were dwindling.
Survival mode again, finding safety, as the sources put it, as it had first been peopled by the axe and hoe.
Control shifted away from the old colonial elite to this new, often inexperienced electorate. Survival often trumped principle, leading to, shifting loyalties, contradictory actions.
Civic institutions survived, but the sources kind of conclude that the revolution here was maybe more about form and phrases than deeds. A change on paper more than deep structural change initially.
Right. Okay, let's jump ahead to another defining moment, the Civil War. After Lincoln's election, the secession debate raged. Georgia's convention met in Milledgeville, January 1861.
And it was a bitter debate, according to the sources. They voted to secede on January 19th, but it wasn't unanimous. A significant minority wanted to stay.
Despite that division, Governor Brown acted fast, called out state troops, seized Fort Pulaski just days later.
The atmosphere sounds tense. Reckless ordinances passed, fears about the slaveholding system's future, hubris leading the Democratic Party to collapse, lots of racially charged rhetoric being exploited. The sources use this phrase, a high insensitivity to perturbation.
Meaning they weren't easily swayed from their course, perhaps, even amidst unease.
Seems like it. And the final push to secede apparently happened without much real debate. A kind of zealous sectarianism took hold, casting the Lincoln administration as oppressive. It shifted from states' rights arguments to just outrage and war.
And Georgia became incredibly important during the war. General Sherman's Union strategy from 1863 onwards was basically total war on the state.
Targeting the railroads especially. The lifeblood of the Confederacy. Cut off resources, cripple their ability to fight.
Confederate General Johnston tried defensive maneuvers, but he got replaced by the more aggressive John B. Hood.
Hood fought several battles near Atlanta in July 1864. Peachtree Creek, Atlanta, Ezra Church. The sources call them Pyrrhic victories, costly beyond belief.
Wins that weren't really wins. So Sherman, unable to decisively beat Hood's army in the field, changed tactics. He decided to suffocate the city of Atlanta.
Put it under siege, constant shelling causing panic among civilians.
And the sources are blunt. Even before the city fell on September 2nd, 1864, war on the civilian population was neither Freddie nor new. Heavy shelling had already occurred. After the fall, it got worse, city charter revoked, council gone, mayor deposed.
Strict controls imposed by the Union occupiers, bans on rebel gatherings lifted only for Union meetings, special prisons set up, harsh newspaper attacks, severe limits on businesses like liquor shops.
Sherman's entire campaign, especially the March to the Sea, had this profound, devastating impact. It crippled the state government, wrecked the railroads, and forcibly displaced, according to the sources, more than half of Georgia's enslaved population.
And the sources emphasize the inroads made on the social structure, leaving deep bitterness in the South.
The symbolic end. The very last shot fired in anger in the whole war, according to these sources, was in Savannah on December 13, 1864, as Sherman occupied the city. The last shot on the continent before Lay surrendered.
Wow. The consequences of that war, obviously huge. Physical destruction, yes, but the social and cultural effects were immense too.
Particularly for women. Hundreds of thousands widowed, needing to find new roles, new identities. Often they were the first to push for memorial projects, forming those memorial associations across the South.
Resulting in over 700 monuments honoring the Confederacy, driven by that yearning, as the sources put it.
And African Americans played such a complex role, fighting on both sides, often conscripted in the South. If captured as free black soldiers, they weren't treated as POWs, faced terrible harassment.
But many actively helped the Union, using their local knowledge, acting as guerrillas, as spies.
The war itself fundamentally shifted things for the enslaved population. The need for labor, Union advances. People started to trickle away. The Atlanta victory pushed many north for safety. By mid-1864, hundreds of thousands had encountered the military, gaining a political, social, economic identity that just hadn't existed for them before in Georgia.
Then came Reconstruction, a period of, well, rapid and chaotic change.
You had a Union-controlled government initially, 1867-68, bringing reforms. Those continued for a bit under a conservative administration elected in 71.
And there was real progress for Black Georgians then. Civil rights extended, access to public schools, representation in government, courts, even Congress.
But that progress was systematically dismantled. Between 1871 and 1889, a white conservative faction took over, creating what the sources term a Democrat-regulated oligarchy.
Their efforts eradicated the Reconstruction administration's work,
leading to a decade of what's described as oppressive machine-administered prison debt and Jim Crow laws, wiping out the games. The Patrol Act from the 1860s, meant to control free blacks, intensified. Resistance faded by 1875, as Black Georgians just tried to cope.
Politics were also shaped by populism, the Farmers' Alliance, and this deep-seated hostility to socialism, and institutionalized morality in society developed.
And specific discriminatory laws appeared. Georgia even passed a eugenics law in 1920, pushed to ban abortions.
Jumping to the mid-20th century now, the late 50s, early 60s, a real watershed moment.
African Americans, fueled by frustration over broken promises and continued racial discrimination, started organizing against Jim Crow.
The first Central Georgia protest noted is a sit-in by Fort Valley State students in Warner Robins, April 1960. That sparked more actions, sometimes violent ones, like during the Freedom Rides.
In Atlanta, The student movement, organized by a GSU student, targeted segregated downtown businesses. By summer 61, protests were becoming more militant, more widespread. A big march in May 61.
The reaction was often harsh. The mayor denounced it, called in riot police, though a bishop urged nonviolence. Thousands protested, many were arrested.
There were attempts at negotiation, but things escalated, especially as white businesses sought more police power. This led to a riot in South Atlanta, July 10, 1964.
Which resulted in curfews, armed police, and this tactic of arresting the people complaining about discrimination.
Despite the repression, these events spurred hundreds of protests statewide, building alliances between black and white activists, showing the growing influence of black citizens.
The 1960s were clearly pivotal for civil rights in Georgia, seen as a key frontier. The state legislature tried resisting desegregation, teacher firing laws, things like that.
But the sources make it clear the federal government consistently pushed back. With laws like the Fought Bill in '65, the deepest changes came from federal intervention.
By the late 60s, some progress was visible. Better incomes for some breakthroughs in white-collar jobs. The intense daily focus lessened, King's legacy solidified.
Alongside all this social change, the state's economy was transforming. Modern Georgia has a really diversified economy, 10th largest in the U.S.
Construction, manufacturing, trade, transport, tourism, film, agriculture. It's broad.
And successful in attracting business. Top 3 in the Southeast for new manufacturing since '94. Number 1 for existing facilities.
Revenue comes from state taxes, sales, income, and local sources like property taxes. The sources give that Georgia Southern University example.
Right, GSU having a regional economic impact over $700 million back in 2008-09, supporting thousands of jobs. Student spending was the biggest driver. Shows how these big institutions really power local economies.
There's a section in the sources, 9.2, on the modern economy that gets pretty technical, talking about professional services and projects, classifying roles like supporter, constraint suggester.
Yeah, even things like building design blockages and checking translational equivalences for complex planning, maybe like flight plans or runways. It's quite detailed, specific economic planning language.
Shifting to culture, late 20th century. Folk crafts from the mountains evolved, becoming more practical, appealing to wealthier buyers. A book brought national attention, increased their value.
A storefront in Chatsworth helped commercialize it. And the visual art scene grew too. GSU offered art degrees way back in the 20s.
The Georgia Museum of Art at UGA started in '48, eventually became a statewide system. Telfair in Savannah, the High Museum in Atlanta, major players displaying historical collections and contemporary stuff.
And music. Georgia contributed a lot to traditional American styles, minstrel shows, vaudeville, string bands, barbershop quartets, jug bands, folk music.
The recording industry grew there in the 1920s. The sources even hint at an influential Atlanta figure, maybe gay, whose sensibility shaped blues and folk.
And apparently, the first commercial recording in the country happened in Georgia in 1917. Fiddlers, singers, songwriters took folk nationwide thanks to recordings made there.
Okay, big shift now. Let's travel east. Thousands of miles to the country of Georgia. Completely different history, same name.
Right, straddling Europe and Asia. Between the Black Sea and the huge Caucasus Mountains, lush valleys, early agriculture, and incredibly, the sources call it the site of the world's first wine industry.
Its ancient people called themselves Cartvel way back in the 6th century BC. Geographers use names like Cartvel and Cartvelians.
Early accounts describe them as skilled stone metallurgy, known for crafty horses, organized into regions with princes and kings by the 5th century BC kingdoms like Colchis, Iberia.
And a real center of arts and culture from way back. Flourishing towns, literacy, amazing architecture, sculpture, painting, frescoes. They had their own chronicle tradition, the life of saints.
So many monuments listed: churches, cathedrals, bridges, ancient cities like Mitsketa, Uplistica.
And crucially, the Georgian language and its unique alphabet emerged in the 5th century. They started translating the Bible using it right away. Deep cultural roots.
This ancient land stayed independent for a long time, until the 9th century. But being at a crossroads, it faced conquests later. Ottomans, Persians by the 16th century.
Then Tsarist Russia annexed it in the 1800s. And the 20th century brought Soviet rule. The sources describe that Soviet economy as very centralized.
Absolutely. Controlled by Gosplan in Moscow, the State Planning Committee. Georgia's specific potential was sometimes overlooked. Production focused on specific quotas: grapes, wine, tea, citrus, mineral water, some metals.
Industry was kind of singular. Agriculture had this weird duality, shallow capacity, but heavy processing, maybe.
Yeah, and it was all based on the Soviet plan, not local needs or strengths. Bureaucracy controlled everything. Local committees handled problems but often lacked competence, and Moscow blamed them for inefficiencies caused by the central plan itself. Rigid input-output system, blind recording of fulfillment.
When the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917, Georgia had a brief moment of independence again.
Very brief. By 1921, they were under Soviet domination again.
Until 1991. As the Soviet Union dissolved, Georgia regained its independence. And since then, it's become known as one of the more progressive post-Soviet states.
It's gone through massive changes, established democratic institutions, multi-party elections, tried to build a state based on rule of law.
Civil society has really developed, too. Active professionals, journalists, lots of NGOs covering everything from human rights and environment to LGBTQ+ rights. Activism, even in contested regions like Adjara, Abkhazia, Ossetia, is part of the picture.
But huge challenges remain, especially developing civic life in places like Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which are largely outside government control, often referred to as being within the ABLs, the administrative boundary lines.
And there's been rising public discontent recently. More protests, distrust of government branches, even NGOs.
Despite that, reforms are ongoing, aiming for transparency, accountability in media, judiciary, police, anti-corruption efforts, elections, building on past successes, but still needing work.
As an EU Eastern partner, Georgia's committed to reforms for that association agreement, especially media transparency, judicial independence.
The consumer market has boomed in the last decade thanks to liberal policies, good prices, lots of choice, but also problems. Consumer awareness, unregulated products, monopolies, access issues outside the cities.
That period right after independence in 91 sounds rough. A nationalist faction, the sources sometimes call them Unitarians, took power in Tbilisi.
Pushing a very strong Georgian identity agenda language, customs, abolishing some democratic institutions, banning Russian publications, it led to civil war.
Eduard Shevardnadze came to power in the mid-90s, stayed until 2003.
When Mikhail Saakashvili led the Bloodless Rose Revolution, ousting Shevardnadze, Saakashvili pushed for Western-style modernization.
He regained control of Adjara in 2004, but attempts to retake Abkhazia and South Ossetia failed.
Russia heavily backed the separatists there, provided military aid. Saakashvili's push for NATO membership really ramped up tensions with Russia, leading to that war in 2008.
Recent politics sound really complex, too. Saakashvili's party lost power in 2012. He ended up in Ukraine. An associate became president. They held NATO exercises in 2020.
But tensions have grown again. Accusations of political persecution, the sources use this term melees, implying opponents were killed or jailed through the courts. Protests met with repression. Saakashvili returned, got arrested on corruption charges, sentenced in 2022.
Pressure mounted on the ruling party. The leader resigned. Big protests flared up over that controversial bill about non-commercial legal entities, seen by many as targeting NGOs and media, followed by crackdowns. The government's stance on EU membership, austerity, also fueled tension.
Failed negotiations sometimes led to odd alliances, like working with anti-LGBT groups, causing local unrest. There were also moves to normalize ties with Russia in 2021. Specific events, like a minister's death mentioned in the sources, triggered protests leading to concessions, like a new, fully proportional election law.
Despite being small, the country of Georgia is incredibly diverse culturally.
Hugely diverse. The sources call it a melting pot formed over centuries. Georgians are the main group, yes, but minorities are seen as a natural, integral part of society.
Major groups include Armenians, Azerbaijanis in dense communities, Ossetians and Abkhazians, mainly within those contested ABLs, Russians in Tbilisi and Adjara and others.
Each group kept its identity, often through culture and religion. Ethnicity can be controversial, but the sources see paradoxically positive moments, too. It's a real polyethnic region.
And they've all left their mark, their watermark, on the culture. Armenian architecture in the mountains, Azerbaijani bringing Arabian Islamic styles to Tbilisi, Ossetians preserving springs, Abkhazians building medieval palaces.
These monuments are called best samples of the art of transferring ideas into stone formats, just adding to the incredible variety.
So what a journey. From the U.S. state of Georgia's founding, that mix of strategy and philanthropy, through revolution, civil war, reconstruction, the huge shifts of the 20th century.
to the country of Georgia's ancient past, its time under conquest and Soviet rule, and its really complex ongoing transformation since '91, battling challenges while celebrating this deep cultural diversity.
Across both places, you really see geography shaping history, don't you? And these constant conflicts, colonial rules versus settler desires, secession versus union, nationalism versus minority rights.
Absolutely. And how culture somehow flourishes even amidst turmoil. Both Georgias are still grappling with their pasts as they look forward.
Understanding these layers, the military tactics, the political maneuvering, but also the quiet resilience of culture, the fight for civil rights, the economic plans like Gosplan versus modern diversification, it gives you, the listener, such a richer view than just headlines.
Yeah, and maybe something to think about is this. Both Georgias, so different, yet both stories are filled with attempts to create order, security, identity through borders, laws, central control, and national narratives. But so often, those very things meant to provide safety became sources of conflict, division, challenges to liberty.
That's a really powerful point.
So, what does the story of these two Georgias tell us about that enduring tension between control and freedom? That dynamic seemed to play out everywhere, across all times and cultures, doesn't it?
It certainly seems to. A fascinating comparison and a lot to think about. That's our deep dive for today.